Thank you, Naomi. Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining this webinar. Um, if you've been, well, from everyone here, I'm sure knows how Project 2025 seeks to radically reshape US governance by centralizing executive power and weakening democratic checks and balances, by undermining independent institutions, curtailing regulatory oversight, and rolling back civil rights protections. The project would concentrate power in the right-wing leadership, diminishing the role of Congress, the judiciary, and civil society. And we know, and I think we're here to see how we can kind of block that threat to democracy as the project continues to promote authoritarian governance and prioritizing right-wing ideological goals over the will of the broader public. And as Naomi mentioned, we have seen and we have been discussing in this webinar that Project 2025 is a further expansion of the attacks that we've already been seeing and studying at PRA. And this panel again will discuss the attacks on labor, attacks on racial justice, specifically critical race theory, and attacks on religious pluralism. And so for this first presentation of the panel, I'm going to be sharing some insights about the connections between Project 2025 and labor, centering a historically and increasingly marginalized segment of society, which is the working class. I grew up in a working class immigrant family in Staten Island, and I live here on the weekends. And Staten Island actually has the highest number of union members per capita out of all 5 boroughs. My dad was a unionized truck driver. And you've probably all heard of the first Amazon union that was established on Staten Island. Our economy is actually driven mostly by small and family-owned small businesses. So we have a rich legacy of working class power. And now, in addition, and in connection to PRA, as Naomi mentioned, I'm involved in the solidarity economy ecosystem, specifically as it relates to BIPOC-led cooperative economic experiments. So those are some of the hats that I'm bringing into my analysis of Project 2025 and the meaning of this authoritarian agenda for racial economic justice. So I thought it would be helpful to share my personal connection to working class struggle. And actually, most people have a personal connection and stake in working class liberation. And so I'll start by defining four-year college degree attainment, or rather lack of attainment, as a primary indicator of working class identity, as this has been most correlated with socioeconomic status. According to the 2021 census, the majority of workers in the US are working class. And demographically, we are seeing a more racially diverse working class force, which is a product of one, nationwide gaps in degree attainment between white workers and workers of color, and two, a more racially and ethnically diverse nation, where immigrants of color make up about 6.9% of the working class. And this trend is poised to continue, with estimates suggesting that workers of color will make up a majority of the working class in 2032. So not only are we seeing, not only are uh, a majority of America's workers, members of the working class, but the working class is growing more racially and ethnically diverse than ever, meaning that policies that increase the economic security of working families also advance racial economic justice. In terms of disability, a total of 8.7% of the American working class labor force has a disability, compared with 4.76% of the labor force with four-year college degrees. This represents an increase from 2019, where 7.8% of the working class reported having a disability. And this is potentially due in part to the disabling effects of the pandemic. In terms of gender, women make up approximately 44% of the workforce, but have borne especially steep job losses and increased caregiving responsibilities during the pandemic, which contributed to working class women making a disproportionately high number of exits from the labor market. So I say all these statistics for the following reasons, pertaining to what I said earlier about our personal stakes in the labor movement, which is one, that the working class struggle is tied to all forms of justice, including racial justice, gender justice, disability justice, and others. And two, people power in the US is both quantitatively and qualitatively the majority working class. So if we're able to mobilize the power of the working class, we will be able to transform society. And how can we do that? Well, working class power and unions are deeply interconnected, as unions have historically been one of the primary vehicles for workers to collectively organize, negotiate, and fight for better wages, as well as better working conditions and broader economic and social changes. And we have seen throughout history how working class struggles has led to improvements not just for the unionized working class, but for all workers. Some notable wins include the Fight for 15 campaign in many US cities, led by the SEIU, which is the Service Employees and the Service Employees International Union. It's led to increased education funding and teacher salary increases due to, for example, the teacher strike, the Red for Ed from 2018 and to 2019. It's also led to better patient healthcare provisions through the Kaiser Health, for example, through the Kaiser Health Network due to bargaining by 2019 United Healthcare Workers of the West. And most recent, the longshoremen strike last week, which dramatically increased wages by 61% while prioritizing workers over automation, among others. And now the union win rate is actually at a 15-year high rate due to rising economic inequality, stagnant wages, and increased worker frustration over working conditions. Social movements around racial and economic justice have also energized labor activism. Um, and and finally, high-profile union victories like at Amazon and Starbucks have inspired more organizing efforts, while political momentum, including pro-labor policies under the most recent administration, has created a more favorable environment. I also want to acknowledge that historically many unions have excluded Black workers and other workers of color, reinforcing racial segregation in the workplace. For example, early 20th century labor unions, such as the American Federation of Labor, the AFL, often barred non-white workers from joining and limiting their access to better paying jobs and protections. But the Congress of Industrial Organizations, the CIO, later adopted more inclusive policies, helping to reverse some of these discriminatory practices. And since then, unions have played a crucial role in advancing racial economic justice by fighting for higher wages, better working conditions, and job securities to help reduce the racial wage gap and uplift communities of color. Project 2025 increases income inequality in several ways. It aims to weaken unions by removing collective bargaining and union protections, reducing workers' ability to negotiate for better wages, benefits, and conditions. It advocates for deregulation across industries, prioritizing economic growth at the expense of workplace safety, environmental protections, and consumer safeguards. The project also seeks to limit overtime pay eligibility, decreasing earnings for many employees. Workforce development would shift a market-driven approach with less federal oversight, which limits training opportunities for economically vulnerable population. And additionally, the project promotes tax cuts for corporations and the wealthy, which would exacerbate inequality and reduce public funding for public services. And not only does Project 2025 increase income inequality, but it seeks to diminish workers' ability to do something about that inequality. It empowers anti-union corporations by making it harder for workers to organize and easier to decertify unions. It aims to eliminate card checks, which is a common union formation procedure, and accelerate union decertification after contract wins. The project would reverse many of the National Labor Relations Board rulings that held large corporations accountable for labor violations involving franchises and contractors. It would seek to reinstate a 2009 rule classifying workers as independent contractors, basically stripping them of legal protections to organize in the workplace. Project 2025 opposes unions because they're seen as hindering free market principles and expanding government regulation. So it aligns with a broader right-wing agenda that seeks to curtail organized labor's power, reduce labor costs, and promote deregulation, which they argue would enhance economic growth. But economic growth for whom, right? So certainly not for the people who need it the most. And it's helpful to understand how racist rhetoric is wielded to prevent working class solidarity. Last September, as United Auto Workers, UAW members, went on strike across multiple auto plants, both Biden and Trump sought to connect with the working class in Michigan. Biden joined the picket line, signaling his support for labor, while Trump he held a rally at a non-union auto parts manufacturer criticizing Biden's electric vehicle policies. So each party's approach reflects different interpretations of the working class, illustrating the complex evolution of political coalitions over the past decades. Historically, the Democratic Party was characterized by a more diverse coalition uniting various socioeconomic groups, including white segregationists in the South and civil rights advocates in the North. However, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965 began to strain this coalition, right? So many white Southerners felt increasingly alienated, viewed the Democratic Party as hostile to their racial beliefs. And this tension escalated actually in 1968 when figures like the former Alabama Governor George Wallace capitalized on racial and cultural anxieties, running on a law and order platform. And then the Nixon administration focused on the grievances of white working class voters, particularly their resentment toward people of color and cultural movements like anti-war protests. And this strategy led to a notable shift in party allegiance, with many white working class workers defecting to the Republican Party. Ronald Reagan then, of course, adopted similar tactics, appealing to cultural fears without explicitly naming race. But today, this realignment, this defection is evident in voting patterns. In 1968, 52% of white voters without a college education supported the Democratic candidate. By 2020, that number dropped to just 35%. Um, and the Democratic Party now primarily represents poor populations and people of color, while the Republican Party appeals to white voters without college degrees as well as the wealthy. So as both parties seek to capture the allegiance of working class voters in swing states like Michigan, the implications for social movement strategy become crucial. Movements must recognize the intersection of race and class in their efforts. As abolitionist scholar Ruth Wilson Gilmore said, capitalism requires inequality and racism enshrines it. Two-thirds of working class white folks perceive diversity as harmful due to a combination of economic anxiety, as well as cultural displacement and social identity concerns. They appear to be threatened by democratic changes that challenge their social status or cultural values, often fearing job competition from diverse groups. And this perception can be fueled by political rhetoric and media narratives that emphasize division, leading to a sense of alienation. Additionally, a history of socioeconomic struggles can create resentment, as some of the white working class may associate diversity with a redistribution of resources that they feel excludes or undermines their own interests. But it is, in fact, Project 2025 that promotes policies that actually undermine their interests while framing these actions as beneficial. By advocating for deregulation and reduced union protections, it gaslights workers to thinking that such measures are pathways to job creation and economic growth, despite evidence showing that these policies often lead to lower wages and diminished worker rights. Additionally, it blames economic struggles on progressive policies rather than acknowledging systemic issues, fostering confusion and disillusionment. This manipulation creates a false narrative that prioritizes corporate interests while disregarding the needs and realities of working class communities, further alienating them from meaningful political engagement. Project 2025 appeals to the working class by criticizing COVID-19 restrictions, which it frames as a government overreach that hurts workers' livelihoods, particularly industries like transportation. It also targets unions at the Teamsters, suggesting that leadership is disconnected from rank and file workers, particularly over issues like vaccine mandates. And by promoting individual worker choice and opposing government mandates, Project 2025 seeks to attract working class voters, especially those who feel disenfranchised by traditional labor unions and government policies during the pandemic. Additionally, the project invokes far-right conspiracy theories by framing the agenda around themes of globalism, cultural Marxism, and a supposed elite conspiracy to undermine American values. It perpetuates the idea that diverse groups and progressive policies threaten traditional social structures, portraying efforts for racial and economic equity as part of a broader plot to control and manipulate the working class. By emphasizing fears of woke ideology, the influence of marginalized groups, it seeks to rally support by creating a sense of urgency and victimization. Conspiracy theories continue to be used by the far right in order to normalize bigoted thinking, to divide, confuse, and distract the masses, and to thereby allow for the consolidation of authoritarian power among those who benefit from irrational, fear-based narratives. But political education that provides accessible analytic frameworks can cultivate critical thinking skills and empower people to be more discerning when exposed to far-right propaganda. And this has been studied. This is a representation of one of those studies that demonstrates this. Um, Additionally, frameworks that reconstruct social relations towards solidarity have been shown to protect against conspiracy beliefs that would otherwise pit groups against each other. Recognizing the critical connection between or among worker power, people power, and democracy, PRA is embarking on a new research portfolio focused on labor and economic democracy. This is based on an analysis that in order to counter the far right's institutional power, we must block their anti-worker strategies, inform frontline mass organizations about harmful policies in the pipeline that would directly impact their base, and integrate a more explicit anti-fascist framework in the labor movement and broader racial economic justice strategies that interrogates and blocks anti-democratic governance power. We also need to build class consciousness to normalize democratic management of labor and worker protagonism, which we propose can be done through political education and through inoculating threats to worker power to allow for that class consciousness and protagonism. And finally, we need to transform the terrain of working class struggle by analyzing ongoing threats to labor movements and assessing strategies and tactics, which may include electoral tactics or choosing the better enemy for social movements that actually improve the material and social conditions of the working class in transformative institutional ways. These actions will help facilitate economic democracy and democracy more broadly and help to build resilience against far-right agendas. On the ground, the resistance or the block ecosystem is quite robust. The continued work of unions, of organizations like Worker Power and Organization and the Rank and File Project, and upcoming actions like the 2028 general strike are fighting for both worker power and broader social transformations by mobilizing grassroots organizing, advocating for higher wages, job security, and better working conditions. They focus on empowering workers through direct action, collective bargaining, and building cross-sector alliances to resist corporate control and labor exploitation. By challenging anti-union laws and automation, these movements aim to democratize workplaces, protect worker rights, and promote economic justice, thus reshaping labor relations in the US. And at PRA, we will be looking at ways to support these resistance formations, particularly through monitoring threats from both the far right as well as corporations. So we're looking at something called like corporatocracy, for example, which is an interplay between privately funded campaign financing, corporations, and anti-democratic rhetoric. And on the ground, build strategies have been materializing exciting changes that integrate both a race and class analysis that I had alluded to as needed earlier. The solidarity economy, these are some examples. The solidarity economy, the Center for Economic Democracy, Cooperation Jackson, and similar alternative economy, political economy models are building the left and advancing economic democracy and racial justice in a lot of key ways, many key ways. For example, they're creating alternative economic institutions like worker cooperatives, community land trusts, and mutual aid networks that demonstrate more equitable and democratic ways of organizing labor and other economic activity. They're also providing real material benefits and actual real livelihoods to working people, making them more receptive to left policies and less vulnerable to right-wing appeal. And they're also building power by shifting economic control to communities and workers, reducing dependence on and vulnerability to opposition from traditional business interests. They're also fostering civil engagement, social capital, and solidarity, especially among marginalized groups. They're also developing new organizing models and strategies that complement traditional electoral and union tactics. And finally, they're offering a positive vision of economic transformation that goes beyond the bloc, goes beyond the resistance to imagine and prototype a more just, sustainable, and democratic world. And at PRA, as part of our economic democracy portfolio, we'll be learning from this build ecosystem about the qualities and the practices of racial economic democracy as sort of the contours of the vision that we are fighting for in a multiracial feminist democratic world. So I'll end there on that hopefully positive note. And thank you for listening and supporting this work. And I'll pass it to my colleague, Ben.